Last week we introduced a new marriage series focusing on what a God-honoring marriage looks like and how we can begin to experience a Christ-centered transformation in our own marriages so that they become stronger, they become healthier, they become more in line with what God actually intended for a husband and wife. And our approach, as I mentioned last Sunday, is going to be by walking through the marriage vows themselves. There is a wealth of meaning and significance behind those infamous words and promises that we exchange with the person we're committing to spend the rest of our life with. Now, I have to confess that in all the weddings that I've officiated over the last 31 years, I've always waited until the actual marriage ceremony to have the couple exchange these sacred vows. I guess I thought it would make those vows more special, that they would somehow carry more weight and significance. I really wanted it to be there in the moment, as if somehow springing them on them in the middle of the ceremony was going to make the couple that much more serious about keeping those vows. And as I was putting this message together, I began to think about that, and I thought, you know what? You're an idiot. Because it doesn't really do that at all. The more I've jumped into these vows, the more I've gotten into the core of what these vows mean, the more I realize that these vows, they need to be talked about, they need to be discussed, they need to be studied, they need to be agreed upon before you say, I do, till death do us part, rather than while you're saying, I do, till death do us part. See, the decision to get married is much like the decision to be a disciple of Jesus. You remember what Jesus said in Luke 14? If you want to be my disciple, let's see if we can click that there. There we go. He says in Luke 14, if you want to be my disciple, you must by comparison hate everyone else. Your father and mother, your wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, even your own life. Otherwise, you can't be my disciple. And if you do not carry your own cross and follow me, you cannot be my disciple. And then, look at what it says in verse 28. But don't begin until you count the cost. Following Jesus, we've talked about this, is an all-in, all-out, no going back, faithful even to death proposition, which is why he tells us up front, count the cost. Jesus says, don't enter this relationship unaware of the expectation. And the same application can be said of marriage. The decision for a man and a woman to come together in holy matrimony, to be united as one flesh till death do you part, is no small thing. That is no small decision. Marriage is for a rest of your life endeavor. It's a commitment. And it's a commitment that won't always be easy. It's a commitment that sometimes won't be pleasant. And it will require significant sacrifice on both parts. But just like following Jesus, the reward for perseverance and faithfulness is absolutely worth the cost in every regard. So men, do you take her to be your wife? Ladies, do you take him to be your husband? To have and to hold? We talked about that last week. From this day forward. See, what you thought began months or maybe even years ago truly begins on our wedding day. Up to that moment, I've always had a way out. Up till then, I could choose to remain me. But the minute I say I do, everything changes. From this day forward, for the rest of my life, it's no longer about me. From this day forward, it's now about we. This is the day. The day I say I do is the day I move from me to we. And yet culturally, it's never been harder to move from me to we because it's never been easier for everything to be about me, right? Think about this. Every day I wake up, I get in the shower, and I use this bottle of body wash, right? Now, I know it's my bottle of body wash because of the 27 bottles that are in there. That's the only one that I'm allowed to use. I have no idea what all the rest of those are for, but that's the one that's been chosen. That's the one I get to use, and it's specially formulated for me. Cheryl doesn't use it. It's body wash for me. As soon as I get out of the shower, I head into the kitchen for a cup of coffee. I open the cupboard, and I choose very carefully from one of my manually accumulated Tater Knob custom mugs that were picked out, made for me, picked by me, paid for by me, right? I get that mug, I set it under the Keurig, I grab the K-cup, I put it in there, and I hit the button. And I make a cup of coffee for who? For me. I'm not making coffee for you. I'm not making coffee for anybody else. It's coffee for me. One mug just for me. Cheryl and I, we run to the store together. We get in the car. She's always cold. I'm always hot. But that's no problem today because we've each got our own temperature controls, right? She turns her side up to 87. I turn my side down to 57, right? And, you know, I've got my side, my controls, my temperature just for me. When I work out at lunch, I put on my headphones. I listen to my playlist, right? Music just for me. Podcasts just for me. Everyone else in the gym, they might not want to listen to a sermon on cultural counter perspectives by Ravi Zacharias. They might not want to listen to the musical soundtrack to The Greatest Showman or maybe top 40 songs from Casting Crowns, Mercy Me, Sidewalk Prophets. That's okay. It's because it's my playlist. It's music for me. It's not workout music for you. It's music for me. Sometimes before I go to bed, I get on YouTube. When I open up YouTube, there's all these videos. They've been specially selected. Guess who they've been selected for? For me. Videos recommended just for me. YouTube does that for me. And then when it's time to go to sleep, I set my alarm on my phone with my wake-up time, and then I turn off my lamp that's been on the whole time just for me. We have never lived at a time where it's been easier to make everything about me. And it's hard to go from me to we when everything is about me. And yet the moment I say I do, from this day forward, the kind of intimacy God designed marriage to have, the intimacy that He wants us as husbands and wives to engage in, requires us to move from me to we. And the only way that's going to happen is if it stops being about me. Grab your Bibles, if you would. Open up to Mark chapter 10. We'll be in Mark chapter 10 this morning. In Mark's Gospel, chapter 10, we read about a group of Pharisees, some guys who were more concerned about the me than they were about the we. They follow Jesus to this region of Judea east of the Jordan River, and they have an intention of trapping Jesus into saying something that they could use against him. And this is not the first time they've tried this. In fact, if you just back up 2 chapters to Mark chapter 8, we see them trying to do the same thing, trap him with a different question, but at the end of the day, they're just trying to provoke and to trap him into saying something that's going to get everybody all riled up. Well, they weren't successful in Mark chapter 8. 2 chapters later, Mark chapter 10, they're back at it again. They're going to give this another shot, and this time the topic is going to be centered around divorce. Let's check it out. Mark chapter 10, starting in verse 2. Some Pharisees came and tested him by asking, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife?" Now that word test can also be translated as provoke. So these guys are trying to provoke Jesus. They're trying to trap him into saying something they can use against him to turn the people against him. And here's what's interesting. They're not on a quest to preserve and promote the we of the marriage relationship from this day forward. They cared more about the me. What's in it for me? How can this be about me? How can I spin this for my purposes? How could they preserve their own ideologies? Now, back in those days, there were a couple of different interpretations about the writings of Moses found in Deuteronomy chapter 4 concerning marriage and divorce. You've got the more conservative interpretation that says that divorce is rarely ever permitted, hardly ever, And then you've got a more liberal interpretation that basically allowed a man to divorce his wife for just about anything, whether it was adultery or whether she simply burned the toast on Saturday morning. It didn't matter. And so you've got these two extreme views. If the woman displeased the man for any reason whatsoever, the liberal view was that it was okay for the man to divorce his wife. And so these guys, they're going to try to trick Jesus into choosing sides, and no matter which side he chooses, he's going to upset some folks. So they think they've got him, right? They try to corner him, but Jesus, he's way too smart for that. He doesn't take the bait. He sees these guys coming from a mile away, and he's not going to pick a side. Jesus is not going to create division. Instead, he asks them, hey, what does Moses have to say about the issue? What's he got to say on the matter? And they're like, well, Moses allowed a man to write a certificate of divorce and send her away. Of course, Jesus knows the heart of the issue is a heart issue. And so he responds in verse 5, and he says, it's because your hearts were hard that Moses wrote you this law. In other words, y'all are more interested in arguing and debating the finer points of Deuteronomy 24 than you are understanding what God had in mind when it came to marriage. You care more about arguing and debating and trying to get people to pick sides on this than you do about keeping a marriage together. Moses wrote this because your hearts were hard. You were too focused on the me rather than the we. The heart of the issue is an issue of the heart. And so Jesus exposes the hardness of their hearts. And perhaps some of you understand this because when it comes to your marriage, maybe your heart has become hard. Maybe you're sitting next to your spouse physically, but inside you feel like you're miles apart. And you don't really want to hear about this right now. You've got no desire to talk about it. You might even be ready to call it quits. You might even be thinking, I don't know what to do, but I know this isn't what I signed up for from this day forward. And if there was a way out, maybe you'd take it. Your heart has become hard. Well, notice how Jesus points them back to the beginning when God originally designed marriage. He says in verse 6, but God made them male and female from the beginning of creation. This explains why a man leaves his father and mother, is joined to his wife, and the two are united into one. Since they're no longer two but one, let no one split apart what God has joined together. Jesus explains that marriage is the union of two people becoming one, of going from me to we. Now, the word picture of that union is more than just a connection or joining together. It's not like being glued together. It's more like two chemicals coming together to form something completely new. The God of all creation has made it such that when a man and a woman honor His plan for marriage and come together as husband and wife, there's this supernatural union that is possible. There is a oneness where they are no longer two individuals on their own. They've now become one. The two me's become we. And if you think about it, isn't that really what we're all longing for? I mean, isn't that what we really want? We desire to have that kind of oneness and intimacy with our spouse. But we have to understand there's a whole lot of work, a lot of effort, a lot of an intentionality involved to develop the kind of intimacy we long for in our marriages. It starts the minute we say I do, and continues from this day forward till death do us part. Now, for those of you who are already married, you probably don't remember bringing it with you, but when you showed up on your wedding day at your wedding ceremony, each one of you brought with you a wheelbarrow full of bricks. You say, well, I don't really remember that, preacher. But they were there. Your wheelbarrow full of bricks was standing right next to you, sitting right there next to you. You hauled them in. And as you think about it, and you think, well, I just don't remember bringing any of my own bricks. You may not be aware of your own bricks. You certainly weren't aware of their bricks. But those bricks were there. And without meaning to or realizing it over the years, these bricks that came with you to your wedding, they began to form a wall. These bricks began to create separation in your marriage as you lived together, as you came together. And so what we want to do is we want to talk about these bricks. We want to address them because it's not creating an atmosphere of intimacy and oneness. So we're going to address these bricks and this wall that gets built and talk about maybe how we move forward from this day forward and begin to tear down the wall that divides us and separates what God has joined together. So the first brick that we ought to recognize and address is the brick called unrealistic expectations. And actually there's probably quite a few of those, right? Unrealistic expectations that we have in marriage, and we come into these things and we think one thing and find out that, it's probably not quite the way that we had anticipated it. These unexpected or unrealistic expectations, they get brought into the marriage, and even though we don't think that it's true for us, we've kind of been set up to think this way, right? We read about it in the books, we watch it in the movies growing up, we glamorize romance and think about fantasy and the knight in shining armor and the beautiful princess. And here's the reality. It's all make-believe. It's just like when you were dating, right? Remember when you were dating? You didn't act the way you did when you were dating. You didn't act the way you act when you're married, right? There's a change that happens because when you're dating, you've always got your best foot forward, right? You may not say the things that you're really thinking, right? You may not express what's always on your mind the way that it's on your mind, because when we're dating, we care about everything the other person sees. So we're guarded. We're on our best behavior. We're always putting our best foot forward. We're hiding and we're covering up anything that we don't want the other person to see or to know about. We go to great lengths to present the right image when we're dating. Then, after the wedding, after the honeymoon, fast forward 6 months into married life, and you come to realize there's some bricks scattered about the house, right? I mean, the husband sits down for breakfast one morning at the kitchen counter. He's going to eat his cereal, and as he dips in, he starts slurping it off the spoon. Loudly. Like in surround sound. You know? And there's this odor that you just didn't seem to remember before that kind of follows him around the house. And the wife, she walks in and she's wearing this flannel nightgown that's so modest and so covering up that it looks like she just walked off the set of Little House on the Prairie. And so she gets on to him and she says, "Would you please stop slurping your cereal?" And of course that rattles his cage a little bit, so he gives it right back to her and says, well, maybe you should have just married Almanzo. And for those of you who don't know who Almanzo is, was Laura Ingalls' love interest on the show Little House on the Prairie. And so he says, yeah, you're dressed like you're dressed for Almanzo. So, why don't you just go marry him? I bet he doesn't slurp his cereal. And so this argument picks up, and it's a carryover, really, from the night before when they were discussing money and arguing about finances, and suddenly, expectations just start adding to the wall. One of the things that I encourage young couples who are about to get married to do is talk about, and sometimes they make a list. Make a list of the expectations that you have of your future spouse. You know how many times I've been told, I don't have any expectations. They're lying. Everyone has expectations. We all do, whether we admit them or not, whether we verbalize them or not. Every one of us walks into the marriage relationship with expectations. Some of them are unrealistic expectations. And what happens is it adds to the wall. Another expectation that adds a brick to the wall is the expectation that we shouldn't have to work at our marriage. If it was really right, if we were truly meant for each other, then it should just come naturally, right? And it's that whole Hollywood fantasy kind of thing coming at us. It's what we see portrayed in all the movies and the shows that we watch, right? That if it should just be a natural thing, we shouldn't have to work at this. That's an unreasonable expectation. Another expectation we come into marriage with is that we should always feel in love. right? If this marriage was really destined, if I found my true soulmate, then I should always feel in love with my spouse. Like the feeling should just always be there. One day a preacher asked this couple, hey, how did you know that this was the right person for you? And the girl, she says, I know he's the right one for me because every time we're together, I always feel these butterflies in my stomach. I got on Google last week. Do you know the average lifespan of a butterfly? 12 months. 12 months. Gary Thomas is the author of a phenomenal book on marriage. It's called Sacred Marriage. I've recommended it. I'm going to keep recommending it. It's in the library. Get that book. Read that book. Gary Thomas says that infatuation, which is really kind of what's going on with the butterfly thing, infatuation has a shelf life in most marriages of 12 to 18 months. 12 to 18 months. You know what that means? It's not looking so good for those butterflies. They're going to die. You know, Cheryl and I, we've been married for a little over 32 years, and my feelings of love for her are as strong as they've ever been. But you know, we've had our ups and we've had our downs. It's not always going to feel the way that we see it portrayed on the big screen or in the romance novels that we read. Here's another expectation that we have is that if our marriage was really, truly right, then we shouldn't have any problems that we can't solve. So if you're married to someone and you can't seem to solve this problem, well, then you must just be married to the wrong person. I didn't have this problem before we got married, so therefore the problem must be you, right? Dr. John Gottman did some research. It says that about 69% of the issues or problems in marriage are what he calls non-resolvable. It means that they're perpetual in nature, and it's not going to change. In other words, you're not going to have a particular conversation, you're not going to have an argument, get things settled, and then for the next 40 years everything's going to be fine. That's never going to be an issue for you again. There are certain problems, certain issues that will always be a problem, that will always be an issue. Things like financial stress. If you're always struggling financially, that financial stress is always going to be there. It's not going to go away. Problems with in-laws, personality differences, differences in libido. He says those things just aren't going to change. About 70% are unable to be completely resolved. And what that means for us then is that from this day forward, we have to learn how to remove bricks from the wall, not so much by changing and solving the problem, but by accepting. And we're actually going to talk about that a little more next week when we talk about for better, for worse. Another unrealistic expectation we have is to think that it's our spouse's job to make us happy. How many of us come into marriage, I'm going to add 2 bricks on that one, expecting that it's our spouse's job to make us happy, right? And what happens? That piles undue pressure on our spouse, which ultimately crushes intimacy. Wherever there is pressure, intimacy won't grow, and it certainly won't thrive. The minute that we start putting expectations on someone and pressure on them, we're robbing them of the opportunity to love us and to express love to us of their own volition. When we make our spouse feel as if they owe us, this is your responsibility. This is why I married you, because you're supposed to make me happy. Then we've made the relationship transactional rather than relational. And when that happens, intimacy withers away. You owe me this because you're my husband. You owe me this because you're my wife. I deserve this from you. That kind of pressure will annihilate intimacy. If you are looking for your spouse to be your source of joy, your source of happiness, then let me tell you something. You are asking them to do something that God never intended nor created them to do. Your spouse was never made or created to be your source of happiness. You're asking them to do something that only God can do. Now, I am not saying your spouse cannot make you happy. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that if you're leaning on them as the source of your happiness, they will never, ever, ever meet your expectations. They can't. Because God didn't create them for that role. That's His role. A better way to approach this is from the perspective of, hey, you don't owe me anything. And that takes all the pressure off. And your spouse will then have the opportunity to give you something. Another brick that comes between a husband and a wife is unmet needs. Unmet needs is a big brick that often gets carried into the marriage. God designed marriage to meet certain legitimate needs that a husband and a wife have, and when those needs aren't met, they become expectations, and as soon as they become an expectation, then we start creating pressure. And what happens when you create pressure? You kill intimacy, right? Unfortunately, when we think about unmet needs, I want you to think about that for just a second. If you're married, think about your unmet needs, right? Just think about generically unmet needs. What's the first thing that comes to your mind? I'm going to bet, I'm not going to poll, but I'm going to bet that the first thing that comes to your mind when it comes to unmet needs is how your spouse is not meeting your needs, right? Unmet needs. Well, obviously the preacher's talking about my unmet needs, right? Heard a great illustration. I think it's really helpful here. You know, here's the thing. You know, if we're always thinking about our own unmet needs first, I think we found the source of the problem, right? When we're always thinking about what my need is that isn't being met, we've gotten to the heart of the problem. Illustration goes like this. It's helpful. I want you to imagine a wife. She's sitting at the kitchen counter. She's working on something there at the counter, and there's a bottle of water sitting next to her. Her husband is sitting over at the kitchen table. He's a little bit away. And so he asks his wife, honey, can I have a drink of water? I can't quite reach it myself. She's like, well, honey, I'm busy right now. Why don't you wait until tomorrow? Why don't you ask me again tomorrow? Oh, okay. The next day, he's still thirsty, so he asks his wife again for a drink of water, to which she replies, oh, sweetheart, you know, yesterday I was so busy and I'm really, really, really tired today. How about if you ask me for a drink tomorrow? Why don't you ask me again tomorrow? Oh, okay. Tomorrow comes, he's really getting thirsty, starting to get a little frustrated, and so he says, you know, honey, I'm getting pretty thirsty over here. You think you could give me a drink of water? And she's like, well, not if you're going to have attitude about it. So another day goes by. Now he's getting desperate. He's so thirsty for a drink of water, he practically begs, can I please have some water? And she's like, fine, make it quick. Don't ask me again anytime soon. Now, Kyle Idleman used this same illustration in one of his messages, and to make sure that it was okay, because he's preaching to a whole lot bigger audience than I am, something like 25,000 people, he wanted to make sure that this was an appropriate illustration. So he went home and he asked his wife, he says, honey, do you think I can use this illustration in a sermon? And her response was excellent. And she said this, sure, but you need to make it clear that the wife is giving her husband water out of her glass. And if her glass hasn't been filled, she's not going to have much water to offer. Clearly, she understood the metaphor, right? Here's the point. Husbands and wives have needs that can only be met by each other. And so the question is, are we focusing on our needs or theirs? The Apostle Paul wrote this in Philippians chapter 2. It's a great verse. Not looking to your own interests, but each of you to the interests of the others. In your relationship with one another, have the same mindset as Christ. Now, this is not generally associated as a marriage verse, right? But I think it's very applicable as a marriage verse. I think this works very, very well. Let's not look to our own interests. Let's look to the interests of our spouse. And when we do that, the wall will begin to come down. Well, another brick that gets added to the wall is that of unresolved anger. unresolved anger. In Hebrews chapter 12, there's a verse that talks about a poisonous root of bitterness. It spreads like an infection. It corrupts. And maybe that's something that some of you are experiencing in your marriage. Like maybe you're married to someone who's angry, and that anger then spreads to you. And so now you're angry. Maybe your marriage is full of harsh tones, and it quickly escalates to name calling and pointing fingers. And it's hard. It's hard to have intimacy with someone who's like that. It's human nature to keep our distance from volatile volcanoes. When you feel like someone's always about to erupt, they're always on edge, they're always angry about something, the tendency, our natural tendency, is to withdraw, to keep our distance, to find a safe place, and none of that builds intimacy. Proverbs 15:1 says, "A gentle answer deflects anger, but harsh words make tempers flare." And in that same vein, there's another brick that we get added to the wall. It's the brick of unrelenting criticism. My clicker here just isn't seeming to want to click very well. Unrelenting criticism. And criticism is something that destroys closeness and intimacy. It has a way of just building and adding more and more bricks to the wall. Constant criticism is not good. Proverbs 17, verse 9 says this, Love prospers when a fault is forgiven, but dwelling on it separates close friends. Let me read that again. Love prospers when a fault is forgiven, but dwelling on it separates close friends. When we love the way Paul describes in 1 Corinthians 13, where we keep no record of wrongs, when we practice grace in our marriage, then we can start to begin removing bricks from the wall. Continuing to criticize and nag and dwell on our spouse's inadequacies or mistakes, it creates separation and it creates division. Proverbs 27 says, a nagging spouse is like the drip, drip, drip of a leaky faucet. You just can't turn it off. You can't get away from it, but you sure want to. You don't want to be close. You don't want intimacy when there's constant criticism. One more brick, and then we'll wrap it up. And that is the brick. And sometimes if I had an invisible brick, I would put it up here. But sometimes the brick of unrepentant sin, it can be different for different people. And we do a pretty good job of hiding them sometimes. But unrepentant sin is a big one. When there are secrets in your life, when there are sins that you are hiding, when you think that you can do what you want over there without any consequences over here, we're fooling ourselves. We're just plain fooling ourselves. I was at a men's conference last weekend. It was a week ago Friday night, and they had this husband and wife speakers that came. They live out in Colorado, and they came and talked to us. And the conference was on guarding your heart, and so they were coming to talk to us about that, and their particular emphasis was on radical honesty. Radical honesty. And they began to share their story of their marriage, which quite frankly, if I had the time to tell you everything about their marriage, you would go, how in the world? How in the world are they even married to this day? And I can tell you it is only by the grace of God that they are married today. You see, they each came into the marriage with unrepentant and hidden sin in their life. He was a sex addict. She was an anorexic. And neither one of them told the other when they entered the marriage. And they managed to hide it from each other for a number of years. They didn't come clean. They hid it for a long time. But even as they were hiding it, they knew that something wasn't right. They knew that something was missing, that the intimacy was not at the level that it should be at. They couldn't put their finger on it right then, but they knew something was off. You see, you can't keep doing things in the dark and it not affect the intimacy of the marriage. Eventually, the sin was exposed. And they were able to get radically honest about the sin. The man had been unfaithful 18 times from the day he said, I do, to this woman. And when he finally confessed it, when he finally got radically honest about this sin in his life, they were finally, and to her credit, she didn't walk out on him. She's like, now we can finally begin to tear down the wall. And as of Friday night when they were talking to us, they are now happily married. They have issues that they still work through. But he's been clean for 16 years. 16 years by the grace of God. Because they were radically honest. You can't hide the sin forever. The Bible tells us that, right? Numbers 32. Be sure your sin will find you out. Every unrepentant sin is another brick that gets added to the wall that separates us. And it separates us not only from our spouse, it also separates us from God. Listen, for some of you, the intimacy that you're missing isn't just from your spouse, it's also from God. And you don't understand. It feels like God's just not there, and you're wondering, why isn't God answering my prayers? And here's the thing, if there's unconfessed sin in your life, then you have built a wall between you and God. And until Jesus comes in and starts to tear down that wall, you can't have intimacy. There will not be closeness. So very quickly, because we're out of time, I want to give you two things that I want you to do from this day forward. Two things. Number one, look at the wall and identify some bricks in the wall, in your wall, that are causing separation and division in your marriage. And I want you to start tearing them down. I want you to identify them, and I want you to rip them out. I want you to tear down that wall. What was it Ronald Reagan said to Gorbachev? Tear down that wall. Let's tear down that wall. And I want you to notice that I didn't say that I want you to identify the bricks in your spouse's wall. That's not the exercise. You find the bricks. You identify the bricks that you brought with you in your wheelbarrow that you've been using to build your own wall of separation. And I want you to begin to work on removing them from your wall. That's the first thing I want you to do from this day forward. Second thing, I want you to pray with your spouse. I want you to start praying together every single day, out loud. It doesn't cost you anything. You don't have to go anywhere. And it only takes a few minutes. Now let me tell you why we need to do this. I showed you a slide last week. Hopefully we can get it back up here again. I showed you a slide last week. 42% of first marriages will end in divorce. 42%. Well, listen to this. Some pretty reliable research. It's a horrible statistic, but it serves the point. Of all of the Christian couples who are married, only 8% confess to praying with their spouse out loud on a daily basis. That's a shameful statistic. Only 8%. However, according to the research, the divorce rate amongst that 8% of people, spouses, who pray together out loud every day, that rate is 1 in 10,000. 1 in 10,000. That's 0.01%. 42%, 0.01%. I don't know about you, but those seem like pretty good odds to me of ensuring the longevity of my marriage. And here's the thing. There is almost nothing that you can do that will tear down that wall and build up intimacy more than taking just a few minutes to grab the hand of the one you've committed to spend the rest of your day, the rest of your days, the rest of your life with, and pray out loud with them on a daily basis. And I'm going to tell you something. I know that this is probably very intimidating to probably everybody out there. I know it is. It was for me. See, I had to get over my own pride. I had to get over my own embarrassment of being the preacher. The preacher! You mean the preacher doesn't pray out loud every day with his wife? Nope. I didn't. I am now. But I didn't. Oh, we started off when we first got married for like a week or two, and we prayed together out loud, but that quickly, life happens and you stop doing that. So I'm a few weeks ahead on this, and so I didn't start this morning, just so you know. I started a week and a half ago, 2 weeks ago. I started, right? But I started. And, you know, I know what it feels like to say, hey, honey, before you go to work, I want to pray with you. What? Why do you want to do that? You know, that's not what she said. I'm just ad-libbing here a little bit. But it was a little bit of a shock, right? Because we didn't do that. But what's interesting now is that now, before my wife gets ready to leave the house to go to work, because she leaves a little bit before I do, she comes in. Because she knows now that I want to pray with her. Do that. Do that. Why did I start? Because I'm committed to Cheryl from this day forward till death do us part. Give it a try. Just give it a try from this day forward and see what that does to begin to tear down the wall that has been created with all of those bricks. Let's pray together. God, it's hard sometimes to confront the reality of our sin. It's hard to realize that we've added bricks and created separation and hurt intimacy in our marriages. And Lord, maybe sometimes we didn't realize we were doing it. And I know a lot of times we do realize we're doing it. In our moments of anger and frustration, Lord, we get critical. We become harsh. Our tones are way out of line. Father, we've got a long way to go. We got a lot of work to do. I just pray, Father, that you would help us to commit ourselves to our spouse, all in, till death do us part, from this day forward. God, help us to begin to tear down the wall of separation that stands between us. And God, help us to come together, united in prayer, before the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords, the God of the universe, the one who made us, the one who designed marriage to be all that it is. Lord, we want it to be what you intended it to be, and not so much what we've turned it into. We love you. We need your help. God, would you come in power on the marriages in this place today? And may we, from this day forward, have marriages that are God-honoring and pleasing to you all the days of our life. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.